right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jill Doherty, and I'm a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thanks very much for joining us today for our book talk on Serhii Plokhii's really amazing book, Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we are very grateful to our co-sponsors for today's event, the Cold War International History Project, the History and Public Policy Program, and the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project. And before we get started, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date with upcoming events and publications on our website, on Facebook, on Twitter, as well as our podcast. And the Russia File is one of them. And of course, my own, our own Kennan X, which I host. And if this event inspires you to dig further into the Cuban Missile Crisis, you can listen to the latest Kennan X podcast, shameless promotion here, which actually debuts today, our second season, and it's precisely on the discussion that Dr. Plokhii and I had on those fateful days in 1962, as well as his research process in writing that book. And you can also find our latest analysis of events in the region on our Russia File and Focus Ukraine blogs. So there's a lot going on, and with other blogs on the Wilson site. So please check it out. So today I'm really glad and very grateful to host Dr. Serhii Plokhii. We have spoken a number of times, and let me just give a little background. Dr. Plokhii is the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. He is a leading expert and authority on the region, and he is a very prolific author. He's published extensively in English, Ukrainian, and Russian. I have a number of his books right here, and they're all really fantastic. I highly recommend them, and including the one that just came out. I don't know how Dr. Plokhii can do this, but two in a row that have just been page turners. The last one was called Chernobyl, The History of a Nuclear Catastrophe. So you can buy all these books wherever you buy your books, and you can also follow the link on today's event page. So Dr. Plokhii, with all of that, welcome back to the Kennan Institute.
Thank you, Jill, for this introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be back to Kennan Institute. I was a fellow at the Institute a number of years ago. Maybe we'll come back in person once we are able to travel. But now it's a great pleasure really to talk about my latest book on the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Fantastic. Well, again, now for our audience, I'm sure there are going to be questions, and I hope a number of you have been able to read the book. So if you do have questions, you can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, or you can do it through Twitter @Kennan Institute or our Facebook page. And please, as usual, give us your name and your affiliation when you're sending those questions. So, I want to begin. Dr. Plokhii and I discussed a little bit about how we should do this, and we have an hour. What we thought we would do is have a conversation for the first half, maybe 30, 35 minutes, and then open it to questions. So please, you can begin to put those questions in the email and the other forms that we told you about. So let me begin. As I read this book, and I really, truly felt that it was a very cinematic book, in addition to being great history. There's the reason, so many of us know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, or at least many of us who maybe even lived through that period, but there is a difference, and that difference is that a lot of the perspective has been from the US side, sources that we know about, but now enter Dr. Plokhii going into recently declassified KGB archives held in Ukraine and doing research in that and finding kind of a different side, a different understanding perhaps of what happened in those fateful days. So, Dr. Plokhii, if we could begin with that, did that new information change your view of what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I'm not the first scholar working with KGB archives. 20 plus years ago, a wonderful book was published by Tim Folly and Fursenko, and they used the KGB documents from the headquarters in Moscow. So basically related to what the KGB station in Washington was doing. My KGB sources come from a different place, from Ukraine, as was already mentioned. And it turned out, I didn't know that before I started research, that approximately 80% plus minus of all the formations, either it's missiles or the personnel, were shipped either from Ukraine or through the Ukrainian Black Sea and Black Sea ports, Crimea and Odessa and Mykolaiv. And each of the ships that left the Soviet Union through the Black Sea for Cuba and then came back, they had a KGB officer. And KGB officer reported on what was happening en route to Cuba, what was happening in Cuba, and then on the way back. And what we get from there, something that we don't get from any other source, and that's reporting on what actually people thought about that. People who were sent to Cuba. How many people actually didn't want to go? Or how many people were saying that, well, we are unhappy that our serving for 3 years, that would be continued for an unidentified period of time. I heard that from the American side, there were also people unhappy for those reasons, serving in the National Guard or otherwise. So that is one contribution. Another one is that we now understand much, much, much better than before how it happened that the Soviets were able to deliver ballistic missiles, 40,000, more than 40,000 troops on Cuba, the tactical nuclear weapons that the US actually didn't know about. And about tactical nuclear weapons or the number of the troops, it was unknown until the end of the Cold War. So there were 43,000, the CIA, White House, Kennedy, who was making all those decisions, McNamara, they believed that there were only 10,000, not knowing that there were also tactical nuclear weapons. So we now know from the reports of those KGB officers that those troops, those soldiers were kept in twin decks of their ships day in, day out, without possibility to get out, to breathe. So with really, really inhuman conditions in which they were transported to Cuba. And another major contribution is that when the Soviet ships were coming back, after the deal was already struck, they were exposed to the inspection by the American ships and American airplanes. Castro didn't agree to allow the American or UN inspectors on the territory of Cuba. So Khrushchev was forced to allow this inspection on sea. And that was a major, major humiliation for the Soviet army, for military forces, when Khrushchev was ousted 2 years after the end of the crisis in 1964. The Minister of Defense, Rodion Malinovsky, addressed his generals and said that, listing all sorts of misdeeds by the leader who was just ousted with the help of Malinovsky himself. So he said that never in history, either the Russian army or the Soviet army suffered that kind of humiliation. And we now know that from the KGB sources what he meant when there were really conflicts on the ships between the captain of the ship who was following the orders and the military commander who was saying, no, I'm not going to show the missiles.
You know, if we stand back and look at this, it is really extraordinary. I mean, you mentioned 40,000 troops, all of these missiles, and the mere fact that they were there is extraordinary. But what was going on in the mind of Nikita Khrushchev that he would even make that audacious decision to do that? What was his calculus?
Khrushchev clearly didn't understand what an impact that would have, not just on Kennedy, but on the Americans as a whole. People who knew more about the United States, including the KGB, were warning him that, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gromyko, were warning him, okay, that will blow into your face. That will be a major reaction coming from the United States. When Khrushchev was thinking in terms of, okay, they put their missiles in Turkey, and I swallowed that. And we have our missiles in Europe, and Europeans don't raise much of a fuss about that as well. So the expectation was that actually the reaction from the US would be subdued. He also was trying to do that secretly. We know now how that was done, with the idea that he would then tell Kennedy after the elections, congressional elections in November of 1962, that, you know, by the way, we have our ballistic missiles in Cuba, when it would be really too late to do anything about that or react. So he was gambling. He believed that he could do that in secret, and many were done secretly and quite successfully from that point of view. But he couldn't hide the missiles for forever, for eternity. They were detected, and really he got the reaction that he didn't expect he would get.
Yeah. And another part of this that I thought was fascinating is the psychological part. You really get into, let's say, Khrushchev's understanding of what he thought was going on with Kennedy, young president, kind of newly in office, and then the United States understanding of what Russia was up to, the Soviet Union was up to. So could you give us a peek into their personalities and how they misjudged each other, why they thought the way that they did about the other?
Well, let's start with Khrushchev. He was someone who was really taking risk. That was his lifestyle, not thinking much about what the consequences might be. There was an interesting episode in his career on the international arena when he flew to the United States on the invitation of the President Eisenhower. So he was flying in the biggest at that time in the world airplane. The Soviet-built airplane, was extremely proud about that. The problem was that the airplane was not properly tested. So, and the engineers discovered that there were cracks in the engine, and those cracks can grow. Khrushchev didn't say no and didn't change the plane. Instead, the half of the Soviet Navy was stationed in the Atlantic along the route that the plane was supposed to take in case there is an emergency landing to save the premier of the and the leader, the head of the party of the Soviet Union. So that just gives you some idea about what kind of person Khrushchev was. And he really didn't have much of international experience before he became really emerged as the leader without much of a competition in the mid-1950s, 1957. He relied on Molotov and others. So it was easy for him to misunderstand and misjudge Kennedy or the United States political system. He never understood what democracy was, how it worked. He believed that if he would apply enough pressure on Kennedy, he could get from Kennedy almost anything he wanted. Of course, there was an industrial complex. That's what Khrushchev knew about. So he was concerned about that. But it wasn't understanding of democracy and how democracy worked.
Mm-hmm.
Kennedy,
and
yes.
Oh, sorry. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of Kennedy, he basically kept asking the same question to his Russia experts. Can anyone explain to me what is going on? Why he is doing that? And one of the experts said, well, but Mr. President, we did the same. We put our missiles in Turkey. And it took Kennedy a while to realize that that could be actually a factor in Khrushchev's thinking as well. Yeah, they really acted, both of them, in the I don't know, looking for the black cat in the really very dark room, there were a lot of misunderstanding and misunderstanding of the situation, of the motives, and as the result of that, really making the decisions that were not very sound, I would put it that way.
Yes, and you point out the danger that there actually was incorrect intelligence. I'm just thinking of one example. Basically, Russia, or the Soviet Union, believed that the United States did want to invade Cuba, and there were, on the other side, there were other let's say, misses in intelligence. What were the most significant to you?
The most significant was, again, from perspective of the Soviet Union, is the misunderstanding and misjudgment what the placing of the missiles could produce. That was the biggest mistake, and the reason was not that the Soviet intelligence was wrong about that, but actually Khrushchev didn't want to hear anything that would go against the decision that he already made. So it's a very much one-man show. No much of discussion going back and forth. There are meetings of the presidium, but mostly it's Khrushchev who is speaking, and everyone else is silent and says yes. There was just one person who tried to speak reason, and that was Mikoyan. From the American side, again, the biggest intelligence failure was missing this mass movement of the Soviet troops and missiles until it was almost too late. But there were others as well, and one of them was that both of them, they didn't have right intelligence, and the intelligence was not coming in time. For example, we met eye to eye, and the other side blinked. That became part of the Cuban Missile Crisis mythology. But Kennedy and people around him learned that the other side blinked, meaning turning the ships back from the quarantine or blockade line. 24 hours after that already happened. So the Kennedy gives his okay for attacking a particular number of ships if they cross the quarantine line. And at that time, those ships are already moving for more than 20 hours away from that line. And there is no that information in Washington, not in Washington in general, but in White House at the XCOM meetings. They don't learn about that didn't learn about that until it was too late. So that is just one example. And then, especially in case of Khrushchev, he really lost control over his troops in Cuba. And that was, I don't know whether it's not an intelligence failure, but it's command and control failure, which was of disastrous proportions.
Which kind of raises another question about Castro, because Fidel Castro is our third character here. What were his interests in this? What was he trying to do? And how did he influence the outcome of what happened in this crisis?
Well, Castro is extremely important figure in that entire story that is too often overlooked completely. So the most of what we have on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the focus is on 13 days on XCOM, on Kennedy making his decisions. If you include somebody else, that would be Khrushchev, but Castro really gets short shrift in most of the narratives that we have. When it depended on him whether to say yes or no to missiles. He took some time to think about that. He was consulting with his aides on that issue. And we know from the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis that Castro was not a yes man when it comes to his relations with Khrushchev. He could say no, and he was saying no many times. This time he said yes, so there would be no Cuban Missile Crisis without Castro saying yes. And then once the crisis was, another point, the crisis was not resolved yet, but Castro was so paranoid almost, he panicked that the invasion was coming, that he sent Khrushchev a letter advocating preemptive nuclear strike at the United States of America. So again, Khrushchev rejected that, considered that to be completely crazy, but that's basically Castro and his position in the crisis. Once the deal was reached between Khrushchev and Kennedy, Castro refused to accept it because it was an affront to his prestige, to the prestige of his newly independent country. He was pushed around by another superpower. He wasn't prepared to do that and fall in line. So at the end, you see this situation where Khrushchev trying one thing after another, and all of them didn't produce the desirable effect. He orders his commanders to show the missiles to the American airplanes and American ships at high seas, which again was a major blow to his own prestige and created this resentment among the military that certainly didn't help him 2 years later. So again, and in all these episodes, Castro is an important, extremely important figure in all that story.
And going back to our two main characters, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, you certainly had brinkmanship. There is no question. And yet you point out that both of them ultimately had a fear of nuclear war. And that essentially, I think, although you can tell us, seems to be the point of why we didn't, the world wasn't blown up, which is both of those men really felt that there was extraordinary danger and they wanted to stop it. So can you talk a little bit more about the approach of each man?
Absolutely. That is an important part of my book and argument in general, because in the book I look at something that normally is not at the center of narrative about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I am looking at the exactly cases of misjudgment, misunderstanding, and really situation where we were on the brink of the nuclear war. There was a lot of that in the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then the question that I asked myself, okay, if they are there and I documented them and I showed why they happened and how they happened, why we are still here, why I'm still writing this book. And the best answer that I could give was that despite of all these mistakes, missteps, misjudgments in terms of each other intentions, losing control over the troops, both leaders shared one thing in common, and that was really the fear of the nuclear war. They belong to different generations in many ways. Kennedy was born in 1917, the revolution in Russia, in the Russian Empire, that really propelled Khrushchev to who he became. Khrushchev was already a grown man at that time. So in that sense, generations were different. But in one way, they belong to the same generation shaped by experience of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Castle Bravo bomb test of 1954, and Tsar bomb test of 1961. So it was a generation not just of nuclear age, but the generation shaped by the arrival of the hydrogen bomb and hydrogen age. And they knew what the outcome could be, and they were not prepared to pay price for that. So the war didn't happen because those two men, they actually got this very healthy fear of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. And we see how they actually try to, Khrushchev is scared, very scared. There is a lot of sources talking about that. He's really frightened. He starts retreat immediately after Kennedy's speech on TV, public speech. And Kennedy is basically prepared to pay the price for de-escalation. He sends his brother to the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin, offering this backdoor deal of removal of the American missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets removing their missiles from Cuba, when the majority of the executive committee is against that. Kennedy does that. And then if Bobby Kennedy's mission would not be successful, he has plan B or plan C maybe, using the United Nations and the Secretary General of the United Nations, U-turn, to actually deliver the same message, to propose to Kennedy and Khrushchev to do this swap of missiles. So he's prepared to do something that was very dangerous for his political career. He trusted Khrushchev with a secret, that he made a secret deal. He was telling on the phone to Eisenhower, to everybody that, no, that was not part of the deal. Turkey is not part of the deal. He trusted Khrushchev with that. His political career could be really severely damaged, but he was taking this risk because he was trying to do whatever he could to avoid, to resolve the crisis, to avoid the confrontation, to avoid the war.
As I said, I was kind of on the edge of my seat, so to speak, as I was reading this, because obviously the stakes were enormous. So I'm looking at, we're getting a lot of questions. So I would like, I have one more question, but I will remind our audience, if you do want to ask questions, you can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org or Twitter @Kennan Institute or on our Facebook page. And if you could just tell us who you are and what's your affiliation, if you could, we'd appreciate that. So just one more question. And I think it's the one that I have the most. It worries me. This seems like such an extraordinary event, but in your estimation, Serhii Plokhii, could something like this happen again today?
Well, thank you. This is the question that I was thinking about as well. What is the relevance to today? And I am a historian. I started to work on that book because I was interested in the subject. I don't remember it, but certainly I was at that time already. I was born. And I was surprised to realize that actually there is this relevance for today. And the relevance is in a way that Cuban Missile Crisis, the situation was so dangerous that it was a wake-up call for quite a few people in the world, leaders, I mean, including Kennedy and Khrushchev. So 1 year later, in 1963, they signed a partial test ban treaty. That's the beginning, the mother of all arms control treaties. After that, the arms control really starts. The non-proliferation treaty is later, and then SALT I, and then START, and so on and so forth. Now we are very much in pre-Cuban Missile Crisis situation. The Cold War agreements that were signed are already gone, all gone. They either expired or the two sides withdrew from them. There is a number of agreements that are still going on, but actually they really don't perform the same function as the set of agreements that existed in 70s and 80s performed. And that the role of those agreements was that the arms race, while it was still going on, it was regulated. There were certain rules. There were expectations based on that. Now we are really in uncharted waters of pre-1962 arms race, which is going on already now for at least 10 years, which is, has very little limitations. And those limitations that are still there, those treaties actually are being abandoned by the countries that, again, today it is the United States and Russia. And there are much more drivers of the nuclear highway than there were back in 1962, which makes the whole situation more dangerous. And again, when we talk today about the arms control, it's not just about the two superpowers, they're still the same. It's the United States and Russia, but also about the rising nuclear powers, China in particular, but also others as well.
Okay, well, now I do want to go to questions, and thank you, Serhii. was great. Let's move on to questions. And there's an intriguing first one. I'm going to read it because I'm actually not familiar with this. Let's see who sent this. That is Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, Professor Emeritus, UC Santa Barbara. So Professor Hasegawa asks, I haven't read your book yet, but I wonder if you could discuss the episode regarding the first intercontinental airfloat flight carrying journalists and officials during this time period, which almost was mistaken for carrying warheads. According to the late Bud Whelan, who is former Deputy Director for Science and Technology at CIA, who was responsible for U-2 flights during that time, the CIA received information that that flight potentially was carrying warheads. And before the order was given, JFK said, how solid is that intelligence? They told him it wasn't really great and the operation was canceled. Do you know anything about that, or can you give us details, I should say?
Well, first of all, Professor Hasegawa, thank you very much for your question. I certainly know your work. We never met, and I use one of your books in my course. No, this is the first time that I really hear about that particular case. What I can say that during the missile crisis per se, there was a U-2 plane that lost its way and ended up over Chukotka, over Siberia, and that was a major concern that the Soviets would decide that that was the last reconnaissance flight before a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, and would surely go for preemptive nuclear attack. That was a major concern for McNamara. That was a major concern for Kennedy. But I'm not familiar with the case that you discussed. And certainly, the first thing, once the event is over, I will try to find as much as possible about it. Thank you.
This is fantastic because there's another question by an academic coming up, and this is precisely what the Kennan Institute does, which is, bring people together who are working on various issues. And there's a lot of fantastic research taking place, not only at Kennan, but at the Wilson Center in general. So this is fantastic. So question number 2, coming from Renata Keller, Associate Professor, University of Nevada in Reno. I am also working on a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis from the point of view of Latin Americans. And I wonder whether the Ukrainian KGB officers wrote in their reports about conditions on the bases in Cuba. Did they describe the Cuban people's or soldiers' response to either the arrival of the missiles or to the resolution of the crisis? Great question.
Yes, thank you. Great question indeed. There is a little bit about interacting with the ordinary Cubans, but not much, because the KGB officers were on those ships and were together with the crews, and they were not they never disembarked. They were not allowed to go freely in Cuba. So they reported basically on what was happening on the ships and maybe around ships. But there is a fair amount of information in my book on really relations between the Soviets and the Cubans, and that information mostly comes from the memoirs of the Soviet officers and Soviet soldiers, and there have been an explosion of those. And they're really very, very interesting and very revealing, including in terms of the disappointment that the Soviet officers had when they were leaving Cuba, when there were no one from the Cuban side coming and saying to them thank you or goodbye or anything of that kind. And the reason was that Castro was extremely unhappy with the deal that didn't include himself. There are also reports, not in KGB documents, but partially in the memoirs, partially in the diplomatic reports which are available now about the cases when the unhappiness with the Kennedy's deal and Kennedy's decision demonstrated itself, including during the party that was thrown by the Soviets to mark the anniversary of the October Revolution, which was, of course, in early November, when it seems to me the commander of the chief of the Cuban intelligence service raises the toast to Joseph Stalin in the symbolic gesture of really rejecting Khrushchev and his allegedly his soft attitude toward or policy toward the United States. So there is a little bit in the KGB sources that I consulted, but most of that kind of material would be in the memoirs and also in some of the diplomatic reports.
Okay. There is another question actually from Andreas Etkes, US historian, University of Munich. This is good because I think there's some aspects that are coming out that are illuminating certain areas of this that perhaps we didn't look at before. But Mr. Etkes says, you alluded to the fact that his failure in the Cuban Missile Crisis was part of what led to Khrushchev's downfall. I was always impressed, he writes, by the fact that the Soviets did keep the non-official parts of the deal with Kennedy secret, even though Khrushchev might have used it to counter the view that he had lost and the Soviet Union had been humiliated by the US. Why did he and others never use this in public? Valentin Falin once told me that they were working on a better relationship with the US and wanted to honor the secret agreement they had made. Were there discussions inside the KGB or other Soviet circles to uncover the secret deal before Dean Rusk did it in the 1980s?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Excellent question. What I can say about the Khrushchev's position and maybe motivation. One thing that we have today, we have access to something that was not intended for public dissemination. Those were his conversations with the leaders of the East European communist countries, and it seems to me they're even on the Woodrow Wilson website, some of those documents. And there he alludes to some secret deal, but he never tells even to the Czechs or to the other East European leaders that there was such a deal. Now that we know what happened, you can read between the lines that that's what he means, but he doesn't tell even them about that. And from another source that we have, again, recently published his speech at the Central Committee party plan, where again, he talks about, he tries to convince his people who elected him really that that was a victory, that was not failure, that he won in that whole story. Again, he doesn't talk about that. The reason why he's not doing that, I would certainly agree with Folly. And what we know, at least what I learned and they didn't know as the result of this research, that there is a dramatic change in dynamics in relations between Kennedy and Khrushchev that change happens as the result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev is someone who is really in the driving seat, who is on the attack, who sets the agenda, and Kennedy is very often unsure of himself, disoriented. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's Kennedy who is in the driving seat. And really, the treaty that was signed, the partial test ban treaty that I mentioned, again, it's signed because Khrushchev accepts whatever Kennedy has to offer him, and drops his demands because he needed legitimacy, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And part of that legitimacy would come from him fixing and improving the relations with the United States. So from that point of view, releasing this information would not help that agenda. So that is my reading, and it looks like that this reading coincides with what Mr. Folly had to say.
There is a question from John Martin from the Wilson Center. Was there a back channel between Soviet intelligence and an American journalist, John Scali? Do you know that part of it?
Yes.
Okay.
It was one thing. It is discussed in detail in the book by Natalia Forsenko that I already mentioned, and it was one of many back channels between White House and Kremlin. But that was a back channel about which Kremlin didn't suspect that it existed, as far as I understand. So one back channel was through Dobrynin and Bobby Kennedy. Another was Bobby Kennedy and Lieutenant Colonel Bolshakov, who was the the officer of the military intelligence. So there was back channel through diplomatic, through the embassy, through the military intelligence, and KGB was desperate to establish its own back channel. And Scali is part of that story, part of that effort. The way how I interpret what happened was that the last name of the chief of the station was Fiklisov, in this desperate attempt to become relevant in all that story. And not just picking on the rumors here and there and reporting them to Moscow, but to establish this channel, he suggests to Scali something that he was never authorized to suggest, that the Soviet Union would agree for the UN inspection of the sites on Cuba. And in the White House, they believe that this is offer coming directly from Khrushchev. And that gets into the letter that Kennedy writes to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev now believes that this is the condition coming from Kennedy, and eventually accepts with all these huge issues and problems that put him on collision course with Castro, then puts him in trouble with his own military because Castro would never allow that UN inspection. I guess it was good for Fiklisov's career that it never came to the fore what actually happened. Fiklisov in his memoirs was trying to say that, no, it was Scali who suggested that. Scali is saying, no, I never suggested that. So it was one of these many miscommunications, but my understanding is that KGB was desperately trying to improve its position, its standing in the crisis. And this is happening at the time also when KGB is not the most trusted organization around in Moscow. Khrushchev tries to do whatever he can actually to make them less powerful. The people whom he appoints as the leaders of the, as the chairman of the KGB are the former leaders of the Komsomol, of the Young Communist League. So people with really very little political weight of their own, they fully depend on Khrushchev. And they're not members of Presidium. They're not even candidate members of the Presidium. So it's a very different story compared to Beria or compared to Andropov later. So KGB are really keep low profile, and they try to increase it. And again, Scali's story is one of those, again, very consequential in the sense of how it got Khrushchev in trouble. But this is the back channel that existed, but didn't perform its actually function. There was more miscommunication created by it.
We actually have a follow-up on the Scali and Fomin issue from Randolph Clark. And he says, was the Yenching Palace Agreement, I'm not familiar with that, but between Scali and Fomin, a convenient myth?
Well, I would say that there were layers of mythology. And when I said before that this is my reading, this is my interpretation, that's because actually the participants of these meetings, Scully and Fiklisov, give different conflicting and contradicting accounts about what was going on. And my reading is based on basically placing this recollections of what happened into the context, a broader context of what was happening in Washington and in Moscow at that time. So again, there is more than one myth and more than one mythology. And again, we're trying now to do our best to figure out what indeed happened, but there are layers and layers and layers of that mythology.
Serhii Plokhii, you deal with history, but here's a question that's going to ask you to speculate about something. It's actually quite intriguing. From David Sobelson, no affiliation, he writes, what if Nixon had been elected in 1960? Do you want to go there?
Excellent question. I think that things could turn differently. Khrushchev didn't want Nixon to be elected. We have now this information coming from both from KGB sources and some information from the US sources that a KGB officer would approach Bobby Kennedy during the electoral campaign and offer assistance from the Soviet Union. And the advice that he got was actually don't interfere. But apparently Bobby Kennedy actually showed the Soviet agent the map, the electoral map. So there was some communication before that. Enough for Khrushchev to believe that he elected Kennedy, that Kennedy owed him the election. And was bullying, really. In 1961, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis is just the last of those examples, but certainly the meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961, that at least you don't see that from the protocols of the State Department, but if you see recollections of Kennedy thought that it went extremely bad, that he was beaten up by Khrushchev, the Berlin Wall, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that Khrushchev would behave that way when it comes to Nixon. He considered Nixon to be much tougher. So there could be another crisis, maybe a worse crisis than we got with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I don't think that we would have under Nixon the exact replay of that story.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here from Hiroaki Nakanishi, and he says, the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis clearly illustrates the need for nuclear risk reduction. Is the Chinese government doing enough to heed the warnings of the past? And should they get involved in nuclear arms control negotiation or nuclear risk reduction talks? I know it's modern, not history, but important.
Well, what we know today is that, again, China has quite ambitious plans in terms of doubling its nuclear arsenal in the next 10 years. Now, with doubling the arsenal, they would probably get, again, if that is implemented, to around 600 nuclear warheads. It should be still very little compared to what thousands that the United States and Russia have today. And from what I know, the Chinese position is, in terms of the arms control, that, okay, you big guys decide between yourselves. Once you will be on our level, we will join and we'll be talking. But at this point, the Cold War is over for more than 30 years, but there are still two nuclear superpowers in the world. And again, I talked about that before. It's the Russia and the United States. So Chinese are very, very reluctant to join any any arms control agreements, and that has been certainly one of the positions or expectations coming from the United States. When it comes to expectations of Russia, they immediately, once the US raises the issue of China being part of that agreement, they raise the question of the issue of France and Britain. And my understanding is that at this point, Britain, France, and China have roughly the same amount of the nuclear warheads. So there are very serious issues and problems in the way how you approach this new age in terms of the arms control, because again, this is not just the issue of relations between the two nuclear superpowers. In case of China, there is of course another major issue is Chinese relations with North Korea and the possibility of influencing North Korean government one way or another, because again, it is a challenge, direct challenge to the United States, but it's also a challenge to the China, which is of course the neighbor and historically one of the two major sponsors of the North Korean regime, another being of course in the past the Soviet Union.
I want to ask you about your writing and how you approach it, but there is one last question. I'm not quite sure I understand it, but it's from Mr. Randolph Clark, who says, how significant were the troop movements south of Miami? The locals were impressed by the rail traffic. Is that something that you can talk about?
Yes, I am not familiar well enough with the geography of Florida. So I have to work on that. And hopefully once the pandemic is over, I will catch up on that. But there was a significant movement of troops. And again, the reason for that was that the blockade was considered by good part of the ex-com, including Bobby Kennedy, as just the first step toward the coming invasion of Cuba. So the preparation for invasion was going on as the negotiations and exchange of letters were happening between Kennedy and Khrushchev. That was the ultimate, the ultimate possibility, the ultimate threat. And yes, that involved enormous amount of troops. So that was all very, very real.
So on the way you approach these books, and I've read now several of them, well, I think what's striking is they're very grounded in history and in data and in research that you've done. And a lot of it is uncovering new data. And at the same time, they're filled with kind of like human moments that really capture what was going on. And I'm thinking in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have the idea that, you know, it was the US and, as you said, eyeball to eyeball with the Soviet Union, and then it was resolved with the missiles in Turkey, et cetera. But you're pointing out that there were moments that were completely unpredictable, that were moments that the world could have changed because of one human action. So I'm just interested, when you're writing this, do you look for those human moments, and how do you bring them into this narrative?
I do look for them, and the reason is that I am interested in this broader context and broader movements and the history of the Cold War and U.S. relations with Caribbean or Latin America and role of ideology. So I was trained to pay attention to those big things. But I'm interested in people, in the way, especially in the way how they react in this really critical situations. And when it comes to nuclear, a lot depends on individual, on the decision that they made. And maybe for the first time, I really fully discovered that in working on my book on Chernobyl, because my previous books, again, one was on the Yalta Conference, and again, there were key figures involved there. It was very interesting, but in case of Chernobyl, or in case with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's not just the big guys at the top. The decision made by the commander on the ground, by an officer on the ground or on the ship, a captain of the submarine, they could really bring the nuclear war, the disaster of the world altogether, because again, the issues of the command and control. And that tells me that, well, telling the story from this bird's eye view with ideology and tensions, it's not enough to understand what the world went through. We have also to look at the people who find themselves, maybe many of them are not prepared at all in the situations where on their decision depends a lot of things. So I really interested in those situations, in those cases. The question is how you get to them. You go through the memoirs, you go through the reports, what you trust, what you don't trust. So it's a little bit trickier than painting a big picture, but I don't think that a big picture would be right and correct without those details.
No. Well, Serhii Plokhii, I'm very glad that you do that, because I think that's, why your books are so gripping. And this one in particular, in fact, let's see, yes, here it is.
Yes.
Nuclear Folly. I actually marked sections in this because they were so amazing, but I highly recommend it. Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis by Serhii Plokhii. And thank you very much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for some excellent questions. Glad we got the academic communication going with some people. And thank you to our co-sponsors, the History and Public Policy Program, the Cold War International History Project, and the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project. So we look forward to seeing you again at another Kennan Institute event, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill.